Hello, I'm Cheryl Brunette, and today we're going to learn quite a bit about lace knitting simply by taking a close look at the fishtail lace motif. I chose the fishtail motif for the sample swatches when I taught you the lace cast on and how to reinforce a cast on edge. These were my samples from that. And I chose this because not only is this a pretty delicate cast on and thus lends itself to being reinforced, this reinforcement can also help to keep it from cupping, which is partly because of the longer length, but probably because of the stockinette nature, it wants to curl forward. So when people saw these samples, someone asked me if I would please demonstrate how to do this in one of my YouTube comments. And I said, I'd be happy to do it, but only if I could wrap some sort of teaching point around it. And as it turns out, there's a lot to be learned about lace knitting by exploring this simple pattern stitch. Here are my first notes, which fortunately for all of us, I eventually translated into this. And let's look at this kind of closely. What can we observe? Well, first of all, I have fishtail lace in quotation marks. And that's partly because how some people define fishtail lace is different from others. It's actually pretty standard, but I want you to know that there is no one fishtail lace. I've even seen this described as arrowhead lace, but if you look up arrowhead, you would see that there are probably a dozen different variations of that. But we will go ahead and call it fishtail lace. That's okay. Next, we have these charts. Now, I actually downloaded a wonderful knitting font. I will give you the link, and I have thanked the person. It's from Air River Design, and I've been playing with it. It actually took me a long time to figure this out, but let's look at how to read one of these charts. I have an 8-stitch, 6-row repeat variation, and I have a larger variation of this. And if you just don't even count anything, just look at this pattern that's there, this pattern that's there, excuse me, you could continue this. You could make this wider and wider. You would keep on adding 2 more stitches in this direction, and you would add 2 more rows in that direction, and you could go ad infinitum. Well, not infinitum, but you could make it as big as you wanted. So how do we read these? Well, the one that has, in my particular way of writing this, the row that has all the markings on it is a right side or knit row, because this is a lace that we are doing only in stockinette. Some lace patterns are done in garter stitch, which is knit every row, but many are done in stockinette. So I only bothered to mark the rows that you had to pay attention to. All these blanks over here, these are just purl rows. You go in that direction and you just purl them back. They appear as knits on the public or right side of the fabric, but you purl them in actuality. Now notice that this is done in red, these little lines here, and that's because this is an end stitch that's not part of the pattern repeat. If you pick this up and duplicate it, let's say you were to put it in a copy machine, cut that edge off and duplicate it, you would have 1 stitch between the bottom yarn overs. That circle is a yarn over. You cannot have the yarn over at the beginning of a row, so you have to add an end stitch here when you're first starting out. You can actually add more than a single edge stitch. You can add more stitches over here to help keep it from rolling or to give it a little bit decorative touch, but you have to have at least that 1 stitch. So when you are going to design something with this, you would make it a multiple of 8 for your repeat plus 1 stitch. So you could use, for example, 33, or 6 times 8 is 48. You could use 49, and all of those would work well. Here you would do multiples. You could do 51, you could do 41, multiples of 10 plus 1 stitch, and then any edges that you wanted to add. I also put these arrows there, which that took me longer than just about anything, because we work across this direction and work back. Now, these are knit stitches. These are yarn overs, which means you are knitting, and when you knit, you always have the yarn in the back. When you do a yarn over, you bring the yarn to the front and just knit regularly, and it's going to make a great big hole. And I will show you how to do that. And then this is the symbol that's the most important when it comes to fishtail lace. This is what we call a double decrease. And in my language, this particular symbol for a double decrease is actually a universal one. A double decrease is when you take 3 stitches and make them into 1. Usually a decrease just makes 2 stitches into 1, right? So then you just have to add 1. In the case of a double decrease, you are decreasing all 2 out of 3. And there are 3 ways to execute it. One way is to, and notice that these loops are ridiculously big, and also the prop department, which that would be I, had a ridiculous way to put them together, but it was really illustrative. There are 3 ways you can put these together when you knit them together. One is so that that stitch comes to the top, the far left stitch, and it will lean to the right. Then you can do it so that the right stitch is on the top and it will lean to the left, that decrease, and then you have this middle stitch. And it will look like that going straight up. So let's take a look at this. This was what I used for this sample. I used the one in which the middle stitch came to the top. But I just happen to have some other samples here for you. These central ones lean to the right, and these lean to the left. So it depends on what you want it to look like. This is a rather tailored look, I think. So if I were making an Afghan, for example, I might use this. But these kind of bumpity ones, at first I looked at those and I went, oh, those aren't very attractive. But then I saw a lace pattern that used one of these, and I thought it was very pretty. It made like a little beading that went up the lace. So it depends on the scale of your yarn, and it depends on what you're making in order to make that work. So how do we execute these things, and how are we going to make symbols for them? These symbols, I would like to say that you could open up any magazine or any book and look at a chart for lace and always have the symbols mean the same thing. That is not the case. They're pretty close usually, but they differ. So I came up with my own set of symbols. Actually, I mean, they're also used, but the symbols that I like to use are knit 3 together, look like this to me. This is the top stitch. When you knit 3 together, it leans to the right. Then the next one is when you want that far right stitch to lean on the top. It looks like this. And then when I want the center stitch to be in the center, I do it like that. And then this is my universal one. This is obviously 3 of them coming together, and I'm not giving anyone preference over who's on top. So let's look at how to execute each of these. Here's a little sample. This little sample, by the way, is not the fishtail design. It is the first row of the this fishtail chart, repeated over and over again. And I wonder if you've already noticed this. I'm going to address this later. But would you notice that this chart is straight across the bottom, but this piece of knitting has a scallop? This piece of knitting follows 3 repeats of this chart. How in the heck do you get from flat to having it look like this? Well, it has to do with this double decrease. Remember when I talked about a double decrease making a mitered corner when we did the mitered squares, for example? And that's what you've got here. See the 90 degree there? it's the double decrease that is giving you that. Okay, so we're going to address this again. This is an interesting point about this particular thing. So let's do the easiest of the three. Let's see. I refuse to use those really fat needles. I have to take these guys to school, to the kindergarten sharpener, and sharpen the ends of them a little bit and then do something, you know, because the kindergartners have those great big fat pencils. So that's how I'm going to try to solve that problem. So in my case, I am knitting the end stitch. I'm doing a yarn over, that one right there. Notice I brought the yarn to the front, and I'm going to knit 2. Only working the first row. I didn't want to work the whole pattern because I didn't want to have to think about following it. And the first of the 3 combinations are the knit 2 together. See that one leaning in that direction? Notice how this symbol matches that. Notice how I go over and catch, just knit 3 together. That's pretty easy. That's the easiest of the 3, as long as you can get all 3, get that needle through all 3 stitches there. And there it is. So I'm going to finish that row. Now, every time you reduce a stitch, if you have to add a stitch back. So a yarn over adds a stitch. I added one there, and I'm adding a second one. This is a balanced lace pattern. Some lace patterns do not have the same number of stitches every row. This one does, because when you take away 2, you add 2. Take away 2, add 2. Sometimes the shapes change, and those are harder to chart. So again, now I'm on a second row, so I'm just going to purl all the way across. Here we go. Okay, so now we have one that's leaning in that direction, and it's very easy to see. Now we're going to do the one that leans in the opposite direction. Lean to the left, lean to the right. The lean to the left one is similar to a left leaning decrease. First I'm going to knit, yarn over, knit 2, get to my center 3. Now, if you're working on this pattern and you're not an experienced lace knitter, or even if you're a very experienced lace knitter and you just want to watch a movie or television or something, or talk to your friends, you can put markers around those center 3 stitches, and that would make it a lot easier to find those every time, if you felt the need. Okay, to make the left leaning decrease, double decrease, we are going to slip the first stitch knitwise, then we're going to knit 2 together. These are very simple things to do. Then we're going to pass that first stitch that we slipped over and finish the row. And then I'll show you how it leans to the left. Notice I slipped that yarn over in there pretty quickly. All right, so here we have one that leans to the right. Here's our one that leans to the left. And we have the only one we have to show you that's left is this one. Let me purl across. When you come to a yarn over, it looks like that. It looks like it might be a mistake. Don't drop it off the needle or else you'll lose it as a stitch. Here we are, oops. Here we are ready to make our straight up stitch, which looks a little bit like a little kid's bird foot, or one of my bird feet that I still make. Okay, yarn over, knit 2. That makes a little decorative lace too, but most of it is just the stitches in the center. Okay, so here are my center 3 stitches. In order to make this one come up into the center, I am going to slip 2 stitches knitwise. So that one is crossed over that one. Then I'm going to knit 1, and then I'm going to pass those 2 slip stitches over. And see how that brings that center stitch right straight up? That's how I did this all the way up and finish the row. So here we are, we have right leaning, there's our left leaner, and there is our straight up one. But all 3 of them were double decreases. Now, here are some things to consider when you're working with the fishtail design or with a similar kind of design that when on the cast on row forms a scallop. This scarf is similar. The lace is similar. This is one of those arrowhead laces, but notice how both the cast on edge and the cast off edge, let's see, which is which. This is the cast on and this is the cast off. They're both straight. So as a scarf, this is cute, by the way. I love this, is my favorite scarf ever. Both ends look the same. And for a scarf, I think that that's important. When I was doing research on the internet, I found a scarf pattern that cast on fishnet and then bound off at the top. So it had scallops at one end and it was straight across the top. I prefer more careful design than that. There's something that just isn't appealing about that to me. I prefer symmetry. So how can you get symmetry when you have this kind of cast on? Well, one way is to graft, to work from the bottom of one end to the center, from the bottom of this end to the center, and then graft them together. Now, this is the original sample that I used in a different video, and so I bound it off. However, you can graft over a bound off edge. And I showed you how to graft before, how to do, it's like a Kitchener. And but those were two pieces of knitting that were going in the same direction. How can I do this? Okay, they were both going like this piece and this piece. And so they were easy to graft together because they fit together. When you bring two pieces of knitting together like that, they're always a half stitch off. And you just have to pay close attention and make it look right. You can do this either with live stitches in this end, or you can do it with, as it is bound off. I go down into this section of the stitch. I don't use the bound off edge. I go into the stitch in the row below and work into those centers. Notice that here's an example where this is where it would be really obvious. It might not be as obvious in the other kinds of decreases where you don't have this really strong line coming up, but you can tell that this is a half stitch off. Here is the left side of this stitch, and it goes right into the right side of that stitch, which is actually the left side when it's turned upside down, but let's not get into that sort of complicating things. And so I had to rip this out a couple of times as I guessed. But the basic method is you go into the hole you came out of on the top and enter into the back of the stitch that's live, come down, go into, and you adjust this tension as you're going along. I'm going into the center of that stitch, up into the center of the next stitch. I've shown the grafting before, and I think I may even have shown this half stitch jog before. Going back into the hole I came out of. It might not be, it was like I didn't have quite enough stitches to get there, so I had to cheat a little bit, but cheating is okay. I will say that by having a bound off edge here, and you can use this technique in other places, by having a bound off edge, it gives it a little bit of a, it's in the back, you can feel it. And so it's a little bit of a seam. If I were going to actually make a lace shawl or a scarf, I would do live stitches at both ends. But I think I've already shown you how to do that. And if not, remind me, and I'll do another one. I thought that I had done that half stitch. Let's see, this is what happens when, I think this is going to be my 100th upload of a knitting video. Maybe next week will be 100th. I have to go back and count. This is what happens when you do so many of them, you can't remember what you did because you're always talking to people about knitting. Okay, so that's one way to solve that problem. But I found something really interesting. I found a pattern that used the fishtail. I mean, this is a really strong tendency to make those scallops, right? Well, I went hunting and I found a pattern for wrist warmers. In fact, I uploaded it to my Facebook page when people ask for patterns for this. And she made them in the round, and let's see which end is which. Oh, there's my cast on row. Okay, duh, okay. And there is a small tendency to want to curve, but this hasn't been blocked, and I bet you I could block that out. So if you wanted to use this pattern and you wanted to have both ends of your scarf or your shawl or your blanket to be the same and not this, which I think is honestly a little bit not very careful, then this was only like 6 rows of a twisted rib. I did it there and I did it there. A twisted half rib actually is what it was. And that worked amazingly. So if you enclose it, that will cause it to work. That's all for today. And I hope that not only do you feel confident that you would be able to knit the fishtail lace pattern, but that you have a better understanding of lace knitting in general. Please let me know in comments down below, or come to my Facebook page, which is Cheryl Brunette Knitting Teacher, where I will post a link to that paper that you saw so that you can, I'll put it in a PDF form so that you can download it and print it off yourself. And I'll put a link down below too. So until I see you again, be brave, try these things out, and enjoy your knitting. Oh, oh, it appears I was not recording. Okay then, that'll work. All right, let's try that again.